The novel opens in 1873 in Cincinnati, Ohio. For the past 18 years, Seth, an ex-slave, and her daughter, Denver, have been living in a house that is haunted by the ghost of Seth's firstborn baby daughter. Until 8 years ago, Seth's mother-in-law, Baby Suggs, also lived with them in their house at 124 Bluestone Road. Before she died, Baby Suggs sank into a deep depression, exhausted by a life of slavery and by the loss of all 8 of her children. She spent her last days requesting bits of brightly colored objects she hoped would alleviate her sadness. Her death came only a short while after Seth's sons, Howard and Buglair, each ran away from 124 following encounters with their dead sister's ghost. Seth works hard to remember as little as possible about her past, and the memory of her sons is fading fast. Most of her painful memories involve Sweet Home, a plantation in Kentucky where she lived as a slave until her escape 18 years ago. On this day, however, she returns home and finds an unexpected and surprising guest, Paul D. Paul D. was one of 5 men who were Seth's fellow slaves at Sweet Home. These had included Paula, Paul F. Sixo, and Seth's husband, Hal. Although Seth hasn't seen Paul D. in 18 years, they slip into easy conversation and Seth invites him inside. Paul D. walks into a pool of eerie red light and feels a wave of grief come over him. Seth explains that the presence is the sad specter of her dead baby, whose throat was cut before it was 2 years old. At her daughter's funeral, Seth mistook the preacher's reference to the dearly beloved mourners for a reference to her dead daughter. Afterward, she agreed to 10 minutes of sex with an engraver in order to have the word "beloved" carved on the baby's headstone. Paul D. has desired Seth ever since she arrived at Sweet Home at the age of 13 to replace Baby Suggs. Baby Suggs left because her son Hal had bought her freedom with 5 years of weekend labor. Seth was beautiful then, and the 5 male Sweet Home slaves waited in agonizing sexual frustration, having sex with calves and dreaming of rape, while she took a year to make her choice among them. She chose Hal, and together they had 2 sons and a daughter. Seth was pregnant with a 4th child, Denver, when the family made its escape from Sweet Home. Seth and Hal were separated during their escape, however, and neither Paul D. nor Seth knows what happened to Hal. Seeing her mother flirting and talking about Sweet Home with Paul D. makes Denver feel lonely and excluded. She reacts with surly jealousy and dissolves into tears at the dinner table one evening. She cries that she cannot stay in the house because the community knows it to be haunted. Consequently, everyone avoids Denver and she has no friends. When Paul D. wonders aloud why they haven't moved from 124, Seth firmly asserts that she will never run away from anything again. Later, Seth explains that she was whipped before she ran from Sweet Home to meet Baby Suggs and her children, whom she had sent ahead, in Cincinnati. The white girl who helped deliver Denver said the resulting scars looked like a chokecherry tree. Seth cries and says that the men who beat her stole her baby's milk before she ran. Paul D. comes up behind her and pulls down the top of her dress. He cradles her breasts in his hands while he kisses each line of her scars. The house immediately begins to lurch and shake as the ghost vents its rage. Paul D. shouts and fights with the ghost, chasing it away. Denver resents Paul D.'s act. The ghost was the only company she had. From the beginning, Beloved focuses on the import of memory and history. Seth struggles daily with the haunting legacy of slavery, in the form of her threatening memories and also in the form of her daughter's aggressive ghost. For Seth, the present is mostly a struggle to beat back the past, because the memories of her daughter's death and the experiences at Sweet Home are too painful for her to recall consciously. But Seth's repression is problematic, because the absence of history and memory inhibits the construction of a stable identity. Even Seth's hard-won freedom is threatened by her inability to confront her prior life. Paul D.'s arrival gives Seth the opportunity and the impetus to finally come to terms with her painful life history. Already in the first chapter, the reader begins to gain a sense of the horrors that have taken place. Like the ghost, the address of the house is a stubborn reminder of its history. The characters refer to the house by its number, 124. These digits highlight the absence of Seth's murdered third child. As an institution, slavery shattered its victims' traditional family structures, or else precluded such structures from ever forming. Slaves were thus deprived of the foundations of any identity apart from their role as servants. Baby Suggs is a woman who never had the chance to be a real mother, daughter, or sister. Later, we learn that neither Seth nor Paul D knew their parents, and the relatively long, 6-year marriage of Hal and Seth is an anomaly in an institution that would regularly redistribute men and women to different farms as their owners deemed necessary. After 25 years of fantasizing about Seth, Paul D finds the consummation of his desire to be a disappointment. He lies awake in Seth's bed and decides that her tree is nothing but an ugly clump of scars. His thoughts turn to Sixo, a fellow slave at Sweet Home, who would walk 30 miles to meet his girlfriend while Hal and the Paul brothers pinned away after Seth. We learn that although Baby Suggs had 8 children by 6 different men, Hal, her youngest, was the only one who wasn't taken from her. When Hal bought Baby Suggs her freedom, she believed that, at her age, she was too old for her freedom to mean anything. Paul D's interested gaze reminds Seth of Hal, whose love was more like that of a brother than that of a man laying claim. Seth remembers that when she and Hal first decided to get married, she asked Mrs. Garner if they were to have a wedding, but the white woman only laughed. With nothing to make the partnership official in any way, Seth secretly stitched herself a dress to mark the occasion. The lovers consummated their relationship in the cornfield, and the swaying corn stalks alerted the other men that Seth had finally made her choice. That night, the other Sweet Home men ate the fresh corn that came from the stalks broken by Seth and Hal. Denver turns to the outdoors for comfort and contemplation. Since childhood, she has sought privacy and repose in what she calls her emerald closet, a bower formed by a ring of boxwood bushes that smells of cologne she once spilled there. One time, as she was returning from the bower, through the window Denver saw Seth kneeling in prayer in Baby Suggs's room. A ghostly white dress knelt beside Seth with its arm around her waist. Denver interpreted the vision as a sign that the baby ghost had plans. Paul D, she thinks resentfully, has now interrupted those plans. When Denver had asked her mother what she was praying about, Seth told her she was thinking about time, memory, and the past. In Seth's philosophy, nothing ever dies. This means that past events continue to occur, not only in one's memory but also somehow in the real world. Seth believes it is possible to bump into past events and places again, and her main priority is shielding Denver from these tangible, painful collisions with the past. Seth ran away from Sweet Home when she was pregnant with Denver. Seth's feet had become raw lumps of flesh by the time she collapsed in the woods, where she was found by a white girl, Amy Denver. Amy explained that she had just completed a childhood of indentured servitude and was heading to Boston to get some Carmen velvet. Carmen, Amy explained, is what people who buy velvet in Boston call red. When Amy asked Seth her name, Seth told her a false name, Lou. If Seth were caught, she could be sent back to Sweet Home. Amy led Seth to an abandoned lean-to and massaged her tortured feet back to life. Seth later gave birth to her baby with Amy's help, naming the child after the compassionate girl. Because the story is about her birth, Denver loves to hear it told. Denver hurts Paul D by asking him how long he plans to hang around. Seth is mortified by Denver's behavior but refuses to allow Paul D to criticize her daughter. Paul D interprets this as a sign of intense motherly love and thinks it is dangerous for an ex-slave to love anything too much. Paul D has learned to love the individuals in his life only partially, so that he has enough love left over for the next person when the first is taken away. Paul D promises Seth that she can safely re-enter her past because he will be there to catch her if she falls. He invites Denver and Seth to a carnival in town that is having a special day for blacks. At the carnival, Denver surprises herself by having a good time. The people they see there greet her casually, rather than showing her the contempt she expects. Because he is such an extrovert and so shamelessly thrilled by the carnival, Paul D is a hit with the other carnival goers. He thus helps reintegrate Seth and Denver into the community, and he makes a few acquaintances. He also inquires about getting a job. Paul D is amused by the spectacle of the supposed wild African savage, because he says he knew the man back in Roanoke. On the way to and from the carnival, the smell of rotting roses is overpowering. Also, both on the way there and on the way back, Seth notices that the three shadows of Paul D, Denver, and herself overlap so as to appear to be holding hands. She interprets this as a promising sign that signals future happiness. A fully dressed woman walks out of a stream and falls asleep beneath a mulberry tree. The woman moves to a tree stump near the steps of 124, where Paul D, Seth, and Denver find her as they return from the carnival. Seth suddenly feels a strange, irrepressible need to urinate and is reminded of her water breaking before Denver's birth. Denver and Paul D take the woman inside, where she drinks cup after cup of water. Her name, it turns out, is Beloved. Her skin is as smooth as a baby's, and she has no recollection of the past. Denver notes that her boy, the dog that was disfigured during one of the baby ghost's rages, has disappeared. Beloved sleeps for 4 days, waking only to ask for water. While Beloved sleeps, Denver cares for her with a possessive devotion. Beloved's presence makes Paul D uneasy. He remarks that although she acts and sounds sick, she does not show visible signs of ill health. The other day, he tells Seth, he saw her pick up a rocking chair with one hand. He claims that Denver was also watching, but when he asks Denver for confirmation, she denies having seen any such thing. Beloved develops a strange attachment to Seth. Although she usually hates discussing the past, Seth enjoys pouring stories into Beloved's eager ears. Beloved asks what has happened to what she calls Seth's diamonds. Seth replies that she once owned some crystal earrings given to her by Mrs. Garner for her wedding. She then recounts the story of her haphazard, patchwork wedding dress. As she watches Seth arrange Denver's hair, Beloved asks about Seth's mother. Seth explains that she rarely saw her. Seth remembers that her mother once took her aside and showed her a circle and a cross that had been burned into her skin. She said that Seth could use these marks to identify her body if she died. When Seth asked to be marked, too, her mother slapped her. Seth tells the girls that she did not understand why her mother had done this until she had a mark of her own. Beloved's presence, especially what is described as her shining sexuality, disturbs Paul D. He anxiously interrogates her about her past until Seth, sensing Beloved's agitation, interrupts him. Afterward, Seth chastises Paul D. for pressing Beloved so cruelly, and during their argument Hal's name comes up. Paul D. then tells Seth the reason Hal didn't meet her during the escape as planned. Hal was in the loft of the barn when Seth was violated by school teacher's nephews. Afterward, he found himself unable to leave. When Seth realizes that Hal saw everything that school teacher and his nephews did to her, she is initially furious that he did not intervene. But Paul D. explains that Hal was shattered by the experience. Afterward, Paul D. saw him sitting blankly by a butter churn. He had smeared butter all over his face. At the time, Paul D. was ignorant of the events in the barn and thus wondered what had caused this breakdown in Hal. However, Paul D. could not physically form the words to ask him because he had an iron bit in his mouth. Outside, Seth and Paul D. discuss the shame of wearing the bit. Paul D. says that the worst part of the punishment was seeing the farm's rooster, named Mr. watch him and walk around more freely than himself. It is thoughts like these that Paul D. keeps locked within the rusted tobacco tin of his heart. While Seth and Paul D. sit on the porch, Beloved and Denver dance together inside the house. Denver asks Beloved how she got her name, and Beloved replies that it is her name in the dark. Denver asks what it is like in the dark place from which Beloved came. Beloved says that when she was there she was small and curled up. It was hot and crowded with lots of other people, and some of them were dead. She describes the bridge and water. When Denver asks her why she came back, Beloved mentions Seth, saying she wanted to see her face. Denver feels slighted that she was not the main reason for Beloved's return. Denver asks Beloved not to tell Seth who she really is. Beloved becomes angry and tells Denver never to tell her what to do. She reminds Denver that she doesn't need her. Seth is the one she needs. The two girls sit in uncomfortable silence until Beloved asks Denver to narrate the story of Denver's birth. As Denver watches the way Beloved eagerly drinks in every detail, she is able to envision the story she narrates. Denver tells Beloved about how Amy Denver found Seth and discerned the image of a chokecherry tree in Seth's bleeding scars. After Amy cleaned the wounds, the two women spent the night in a lean-to shelter. The next morning, Amy helped Seth limp down to the river, where they found a leaky boat with one oar. It was upon stepping into the boat that Seth's water broke. It seemed as though the newborn Denver might die, but Amy finally coaxed a whimper out of her. Later that evening, Amy left Seth waiting by the river bank for a chance to cross the river to Ohio. Beloved incites the narration of history time and again. Often, she directly questions Denver and Seth about the past, but Beloved also has an indirect influence, which the scene between Seth and Paul D illustrates. It is the couple's argument over Beloved that sparks Paul D's revelation of Hal's fate to Seth. Once Beloved has kindled the storytelling process, Seth and Paul D devote their own energies to it, despite the pain that is involved. For as Amy says to Seth in Chapter 3 about Seth's throbbing feet, anything dead coming back to life hurts. On a certain level, both Seth and Paul D realize that it is worth the pain to bring their memories back to life, back into the open. In releasing these memories, they themselves can come back to life and live again without fear. Aware of the pain it will cause, Seth and Paul D nevertheless proceed to fill in the gaps in each other's knowledge of the past. For both characters, forming a coherent identity involves weaving together the fragments of their past into a coherent narrative. Disturbed by Paul D's information about Hal and missing the soothing presence that Baby Suggs once provided, Seth seeks comfort in a place called the Clearing. She takes Denver and Beloved with her. Before Baby Suggs fell into a depression, for which Seth blames herself, the older woman used to preach to the black community of Cincinnati in the Clearing. She would begin by having the people participate in a cathartic mixture of crying, laughter, and dance, and she would then preach self-love. She would instruct them to love their hands that had been bound, their mouths that had been silenced, and, most of all, their hearts. Seth recalls the day she arrived at 124 and met Baby Suggs for the first time. After Denver's birth and Amy Denver's departure, she came across a black man fishing with two boys. The man, Stampede, wrapped Denver in a jacket and poled Seth across the Ohio. On shore, he left a signal for Ella, another organizer of the Underground Railroad, which alerted her to the presence of a passenger who needed help. When Ella arrived, Seth explained that she was heading to Baby Suggs's house on Bluestone Road. Ella, noting Seth's attachment to Denver, voiced her opinion that one shouldn't love anything too much. When Seth got to 124, Baby Suggs welcomed and bathed her before allowing her to see her two boys and her. Crawling already? Girl. To amuse her daughter, Seth jingled the earrings that Mrs. Garner had given her. During the 28 days she spent in Cincinnati before her daughter's death, Seth enjoyed being a part of the community. In the Clearing, she had felt for the first time as though she owned herself. As she sits on Baby Suggs's old rock in the Clearing, Seth calls silently for the coming fingers of her deceased mother-in-law. She begins to feel Baby Suggs massaging her neck, but the touch turns suddenly violent and Seth realizes she is being strangled. Denver reacts with alarm, and Beloved caresses and kisses the bruises on Seth's neck. Beloved's breath smells like milk to Seth, and her touch feels like that of the baby's ghost. Alarmed, Seth pushes Beloved away, saying, "You're too old for that." Later, Denver accuses Beloved of strangling Seth. Beloved runs away in anger, insisting that Seth was being choked by the circle of iron, not by her. We learn that as a 7-year-old Denver attended school lessons with other black children at the home of a woman they called Lady Jones. Denver had been studying there for a year when her classmate Nelson Lord upset her by asking, "Didn't your mother get locked away for murder?" Denver repeated the question to her mother, but she went deaf before she could hear him answer. This deafness was cured by the sound of the baby ghost climbing the stairs. It was the first time the ghost had appeared. But after this first innocuous manifestation, the ghost proceeded to become spiteful, angry, and deliberately abusive. Thinking back to these acts of rage, Denver wonders what havoc Beloved might now wreak on Seth. Yet she believes she has no power to stop her, especially since she so often feels captivated by the girl. When she goes to Beloved to seek forgiveness for fighting with her, she sees Beloved watching two turtles mate. Paul D. was sent to prison in Alfred, Georgia, because he tried to kill Brandywine, the man to whom school teachers sold him. The prison had 46 inmates, all of them black men. They were locked in small boxes in the ground at night and were subject to sexual abuse and chain gang work during the day. During this time Paul D. began to tremble chronically, and his trembling only subsided when he was actively working and singing in the chain gang. Once, during a long rainstorm, the ground turned to mud, which allowed the prisoners to work together and escape. Linked together with one chain, they walked to a camp of ailing Cherokees, who broke their chains. They directed Paul D. northward by telling him that he should follow the blooms of the flowers as the warm spring temperatures spread from south to north. In Delaware he met a weaver woman with whom he proceeded to live for 18 months. As time went on, he locked all his painful memories of the prison and sweet home into the tobacco tin lodged in his chest. Denver's attachment to Beloved intensifies. Beloved's gaze sustains and completes Denver, and Denver fears that she has no self apart from Beloved. Meanwhile, Seth, ignoring her earlier sense that Beloved is her daughter's reincarnation, decides that Beloved must have recently escaped from years of captivity. She knows Ella to have endured such an experience. A white man and his son locked her up and raped her repeatedly. Denver often feels lonely and rejected by Beloved. When she isn't directly stimulated, Beloved lapses into a dreamy silence, and she never interacts as much with Denver as she does with Seth. Denver, interested only in the present, does not care for the stories about the past that Seth narrates in response to Beloved's questions. Denver also knows about Beloved's attentions to Paul D. because she has noted her nighttime trips to the cold house where he sleeps. One day, Denver and Beloved go into the cold house to get cider. Suddenly, Beloved disappears into the darkness. Denver is certain that Beloved has gone forever and begins to cry, only to find Beloved in front of her, smiling. Beloved reassures Denver by telling her, "This the place I am." Beloved then drops to the ground, where she curls up and moans softly. Her eyes focus on a spot in the darkness where she claims to see her face. When Denver asks her to clarify, she says mysteriously, "It's me." Thinking about school teacher's arrival at Sweet Home makes Paul D. again question the legitimacy of his manhood in the way that school teacher used to force him to do. He likens Beloved's current manipulation of him to school teacher's abuse and decides that the only way he can hope to stop Beloved is to tell Seth what has been happening. He meets her outside the restaurant where she works, but he cannot muster up enough courage to confess that he is not a man. He surprises himself and Seth, who thinks he is about to tell her he is leaving by asking her to have a baby with him. It begins to snow, and they laugh and flirt on the walk home. Beloved, who has been waiting for Seth, meets them outside and absorbs Seth's attention, leaving Paul D. feeling cold and resentful. Seth, however, breaks Beloved's spell by insisting that Paul D. resumes sleeping with her at night. Seth decides she cannot have a baby with Paul D. because was carefree, mother love was a killer. She begins to question Paul D.'s intentions. Perhaps, she thinks, he is jealous of Denver and Beloved and wants his own family. Ultimately, Seth recognizes that she is just trying to justify her decision to not have any more children. After Seth takes Paul D. upstairs, Beloved begs Denver to drive Paul D. away, but Denver replies that Seth will be angry at Beloved if Paul D. leaves. One of Beloved's teeth falls out, and she wonders fearfully if her entire body will begin to fall apart. She finds it difficult to feel complete and unified when Seth is away. Beloved begins to cry, and Denver takes her in her arms, while the snow gathering outside 124 piles higher and higher. The language used to describe Denver's relationship with Beloved is loaded with a vocabulary of need and desire. Denver feels that Beloved's interested gaze sends her to a place beyond appetite and that looking at Beloved is food enough. Beloved provides emotional sustenance for Denver in a way that Seth never could, because Denver is simultaneously responsible for and dependent upon Beloved. Beloved's constant neediness is most like an infant's desire for its mother. When Seth is not there for Beloved, Denver becomes a sort of surrogate mother figure. She is forced out of her role as a daughter and into a more adult role that involves working in the interest of another's welfare. After Seth first arrived at 124, Stampede brought over 2 pails of rare, deliciously sweet blackberries. Baby Suggs decided to bake some pies, and before long the celebration had transformed into a feast for 90 people. The community celebrated long into the night but grew jealous and angry as the feast wore on. To them, the excess of the feast was a measure of Baby Suggs's unwarranted pride. Baby Suggs sensed a dark and coming thing in the distance, but the atmosphere of jealousy created by the townspeople clouded her perception. From Seth's arrival at 124, the narration goes even further back in time to Sweet Home. Although it meant leaving behind the only child she had been able to see grow to adulthood, Baby Suggs allowed Howell to buy her freedom because it mattered so much to him. Once she left Sweet Home, Baby Suggs realized how sweet freedom could be. While Mr. Garner drove her to Cincinnati, she asked him why he and Mrs. Garner called her Jenny. He told her that Jenny Whitlow was the name on her bill of sale. She explains the origin of her real name. Suggs was her husband's name, and he called her Baby. Mr. Garner tells her that Baby Suggs is no name for a freed Negro. He takes Baby Suggs to Ohio to meet the Bodwins, 2 white abolitionist siblings who allow Baby Suggs to live at 124 Bluestone Road in exchange for domestic work. Baby Suggs is unable to learn anything about the whereabouts of her lost children. One day, about a month after Seth arrived at 124, school teachers showed up at the house with one of his nephews, the sheriff, and a slave catcher. In the woodshed, they found Seth's sons, Howard and Bugler, lying in the sawdust, bleeding. Seth was holding her bleeding, crawling already daughter, whose throat she had cut with a saw. Stampede rushed in and grabbed Denver before Seth could dash her brains out against the wall. Because none of the children could ever be of any use as a slave, school teacher concluded that there was nothing worth claiming at 124 and left in disgust. Seth's older daughter was dead, but Baby Suggs bound the boy's wounds and struggled with Seth over Denver. Denver nursed at Seth's breast, ingesting her dead sister's blood along with her mother's milk. The sheriff took Seth, with Denver in her arms, to jail. Stampede shows Paul D. a newspaper clipping with a drawing of Seth, but Paul D., refusing to believe that the woman depicted as Seth, insists that ain't her mouth. Paul D. can't read, so Stampede tells him the story of Seth's tragedy. Stampede leaves some parts of the story out, though. He doesn't tell how Seth grabbed her children and flew with them to the woodshed like a hawk on the wing, nor does he mention that, out of jealous spite, the community neglected to warn Seth about school teachers' approach. When Paul D. confronts Seth with the newspaper clipping, she begins to circle frantically around the room in a manner that parallels the circular manner in which she unravels her story for him. She tells Paul D. how, at 124, she began to love her children with renewed force, because she knew finally that they were fully hers to love. When she recognized school teacher's hat outside the house one day, she felt hummingbird wings beating around her head and could think only, no. No. No, no. No, no, no. Killing her children was a way of protecting them from the horrors of slavery she had herself endured, a way to secure their safety. Paul D. tells her that her love is too thick. He feels distanced from Seth and condemns her act, saying, "You got 2 feet, Seth, not 4, by which he suggests that she acted like a beast in attempting to murder her own children. His anxiety increases when he sees Beloved standing on the staircase. He leaves 124, and Seth simply says, "So long." Although he does not say so, Seth knows that Paul D. isn't coming back. Like a parasite, Beloved begins to drain Seth's life force. Seth arrives at work later every morning until she loses her job. The food in the house begins to run low, and Seth sacrifices her portion for Beloved, who grows fat while Seth wastes away. Beloved wears Seth's clothing and copies her mannerisms until Denver has trouble telling them apart. Their roles merge and invert as Seth comes to act like a child while Beloved looms over her like a mother. When Seth tries to assert herself, Beloved reacts violently and breaks things, and the two fight constantly. Seth points out how much she has suffered for her children, but Beloved accuses her of leaving her behind. Denver begins to fear that Beloved will kill her mother. Denver decides to leave 124 to find help. Before she can do so, she needs and gets some encouragement from the spirit of baby Suggs, because Denver hasn't left the house by herself in 12 years and fears the outside world. Not knowing where else to turn, Denver goes to the house of her former teacher, Lady Jones. Although part of the black community, Lady Jones has yellow hair and gray eyes. Ironically, Lady Jones was chosen to attend a school in Pennsylvania for colored girls because of her light skin. Afterward, she devoted herself to teaching those who were not picked to attend school. Because she loathes her yellow hair, she married the darkest man she could find. She is convinced that everyone, including her own children, despises her and her hair. Omitting mention of Beloved, Denver explains that her mother is sick and asks Lady Jones if there is any work she can do in exchange for food. Lady Jones knows of no work, but she tells everyone at church about Seth's troubles. Denver begins finding plates and baskets of food on the tree stump in front of 124. Many include a slip of paper with the donator's name, and as Denver ventures out to return the containers to their owners, she becomes acquainted with the community. Lady Jones also offers her weekly reading lessons. As the trouble at 124 continues, Denver visits the Bodwins for help. Their black maid, Janie, answers the door and recognizes Denver as a relative of baby Suggs. Denver tells her about Beloved, and Janie circulates the story around town. Denver secures a job with the Bodwins, but as she leaves their house she is disturbed by the sight of a figurine on display. The statuette is a slave who holds coins in its mouth. At its base is a tag that reads, "At your service." Ella hears Denver's story. Although she sees Beloved's tormenting presence as a fair punishment for Seth's act of infanticide, she does not believe that the punishment is right, because she believes that past sins should stay in the past. She empathizes with Seth because she also once refused to care for her child. The child was born of abuse after Ella had been locked up for a year and repeatedly raped by a father and son. Ella decides to rally a group of roughly 30 black women to exorcise Beloved from 124. They march to Seth's house, where Denver is waiting for Mr. Bodwin to pick her up for work. Stampede tells Paul D about the recent events at 124. The old man says he no longer hears the voices around the house that he used to, and that Beloved disappeared in the chaos that followed Seth's attempted attack on Mr. Bodwin. A small boy said he saw a naked woman running through the woods with fish for air, but no one has seen her since. Paul D asks Denver if she believes Beloved really was her baby sister who had come back from the other side. Denver replies that she believes Beloved to have been her sister, but, at times, she thinks Beloved was more. Denver continues to work for Miss Bodwin, who is giving her informal academic training in the hopes of sending Denver to Oberlin College. Denver warns Paul D to speak kindly to Seth, who has not yet recovered entirely. Paul D walks to 124 and thinks about the series of escapes he has undertaken in his life. He ran from Sweet Home. He ran from Alfred, Georgia. And, during the war, he worked for both sides and ran from both. After the war, he thought he was free to walk the roads, but he saw dead blacks strewn everywhere, including women and children. He still had to keep running. Paul D. wonders why he ran from Seth. When Paul D. reaches 124, he senses that Beloved has left forever. He finds Seth lying in Baby Suggs' bed with vacant eyes. He fears that, like Baby Suggs before her, Seth wants simply to lie down and wait for death. He tells her that he wants to help Denver take care of her. She replies miserably that her best thing has left her again, and Paul D. wonders at the range of emotions that Seth inspires in him. 60 once told him that his 30-mile woman inspired his love because she gathered up the jumbled pieces of him and gave them back to him in order. Paul thinks that Seth does the same for him. She helps him to stop being ashamed of his past, and he notes that when he is with her, the memories of being collared and muzzled like a beast no longer have the power to steal his manhood from him. He tells her they have more of yesterday than they need and that they need more tomorrow to make the yesterday bearable. Taking her hand, he tells Seth that she shouldn't consider Beloved's departure to be the departure of her best thing. Seth, and not her children, is her own best thing. As though Beloved were a bad dream, everyone tries to forget her. The community sees her as the representative of an implacable loneliness that cannot be soothed or rocked away. Never satisfied, it roams and devours. Seth, Denver, and Paul D. take longer to forget Beloved than the townspeople do. Nevertheless, after a while they realize they cannot remember or repeat a single thing she said. In fact, they cannot say with certainty that she was ever really there. When Paul D. first showed up at the doorstep of 124, he seemed aware of the necessity of confronting the past in order to escape its grip. He assured Seth that with him there to pull her out, she should feel safe about venturing inside her painful memories. When Beloved's arrival forces Seth to face the past, these memories begin, as Seth feared, to consume her completely. Only with the help of those around her can Seth escape Beloved's hold. Denver keeps Seth alive, the community helps to expel Beloved, and Paul D. supports Seth by telling her that she, and not her children, is her own best thing. By dealing with the past, Seth and Paul D. secure the possibility of enjoying a future together. Beloved performs a similar function. The novel catalogs a past that contemporary readers must contend with before moving forward. Through most of the book, the narrator filters almost all of the story through the various perspectives of Seth, Paul D., Denver, Baby Suggs, Stampede, school teacher, Lady Jones, Mr. Bodwin, Beloved, and Ella. In the short, closing chapter of the book, Morrison returns the narration to a more universalized, abstracted, and distanced voice. The result is poetic, words rhyme and phrases repeat, affecting an almost trance-like state in the reader. Morrison punctuates these mesmerizing, cadenced paragraphs, describing how everyone gradually forgot Beloved, with the blunt explanation, it was not a story to pass on. Enigmatically, this phrase evolves, by the chapter's end, into a warning, this is not a story to pass on. And yet Beloved does pass its story on. Its purpose is to restore history to a people whose history has been erased by centuries of willed forgetfulness and forced silence. The narrator's warning is intended to remind us that it is not easy to keep that history in our memory. Nor is it necessarily helpful for us to remember that history if it is not conveyed with responsibility and sensitivity. Resurrecting the past is a painful process, and Beloved is an emotionally painful book to read. Like its title character, it is a difficult entity to contend with, one that can inspire or distress the reader with equal intensity. Yet, by engaging with this disturbing, unrelenting force in a conscientious way, we may begin to understand the past, as well as its impact on our present. When Stampede hears that Paul D. has left 124, he feels guilty for having told Paul D. about Seth's crime without considering her family's welfare. Stampede reminds himself that he has a duty to Seth and Denver by virtue of their connection to Baby Suggs, of whom he was very fond. He thinks about her late-life depression, which deeply saddened him. He tried to convince her to continue preaching God's word, but she claimed she had lost all motivation after the white man's intrusion into her household. For the first time since Baby Suggs's death, Stamp returns to 124. When he approaches the house, he hears a clamor of disturbing, disembodied conversation. He can discern only the word mine. Although he has a habit of walking into houses without knocking, it is the one privilege he claims in exchange for the good he does for the Cincinnati community. Stampede feels uncomfortable entering 124 unannounced. He stands awkwardly at the door and thinks about what he ought to do. Seth takes Beloved and Denver ice skating, partly to show that she has not been devastated by Paul D's departure. Later, Seth hears Beloved humming a song Seth made up to sing to her children. Faced with such evidence, Seth finally recognizes Beloved as her resurrected daughter. Now that her dead child has rejoined her, she decides to discard the past and the future for the timeless present of 124. After returning to 124 several more times and finding himself unable to knock on each occasion, Stampede finally works up the courage to knock on Seth's door. No one answers. When he peeks in the window, he sees Denver sleeping in front of the fire, but he does not recognize Beloved and her presence disturbs him. When he asks around about the stranger in Seth's home, his friend Ella tells him that Paul D is sleeping at the church. Stamp chastises Ella for not offering Paul D a place to stay, and he is angered by the community's general neglect of Paul D and of the women. Stamp wonders whether perhaps he has made a mistake in staying away from 124 for so long, whether he might not owe something to baby Suggs's kin. Earlier in his life, he decided that he no longer owed anyone anything. While a slave, Stamp was forced to give his wife to his master's son to sleep with, and he concluded that his wife was a gift so terrible that it freed him forever after of all obligation. For this reason, he changed his name from Joshua to Stampede. Seth cooks all morning at a restaurant and then takes her lunch home. Occasionally, she steals food and supplies because she is too proud to endure the local grocer's racism. She feels ashamed of her petty thievery and remembers an occasion when Sixo stole a small pig from Sweet Home. When school teacher confronted him, Sixo cleverly talked his way out of blame by insisting that he was actually improving school teacher's property by feeding himself so that he could better work the land. School teacher whipped him to teach him that definitions belong to the definers, not to the defined. With Chapter 20, a series of stream of consciousness monologues begins. Seth speaks in this chapter, followed by Denver in Chapter 21 and Beloved in Chapter 22. Chapter 23 comprises a chorus of the three voices. In Chapter 20, Seth begins, Beloved, she my daughter. She mine. Seth wants to explain everything to Beloved so that her daughter will understand why her own mother killed her. Seth cannot understand why, despite all the clues, she initially failed to recognize that Beloved was her daughter incarnate. She decides Paul D must have distracted her. Throughout the chapter, Seth ponders the power of a mother's love. She remembers that her own mother was hanged, but she does not know the circumstances that prompted the lynching. Perhaps her mother attempted to run away, but without Seth. Seth wants to believe her mother would never have abandoned her, that she was as devoted a mother as Seth herself is. After killing Beloved, Seth wanted to lie down in the grave with her dead daughter. Yet she knew she couldn't give up. She had to keep going for the sake of her three living children. Denver's voice emerges in this chapter, which begins, Beloved is my sister. Denver knows that she swallowed her sister's blood along with her mother's milk. She confesses that she has loved Seth out of fear, and that Howard and Bugler ran away because they, like Denver, feared that whatever it was that motivated Seth to kill her children might resurface one day. Denver believes that Beloved returned to help her wait for her father to come home. Denver is also convinced that she must protect Beloved from Seth. She remembers everything baby Suggs told her about Hal, which was that he was an angel who loved things too much. The power of his love used to scare baby Suggs because she knew that the large size of his heart made it an easy target. Denver's youth has been comprised of her fear of her mother and her hope for her father's arrival. Beloved's fragmented and complex monologue constitutes the third of the first-person stream of consciousness monologues. She begins, I am Beloved and she is mine. Her patchy memories are of a time when she crouched among dead bodies. She speaks of thirst and hunger, of death and sickness, and of men without skin. She says all the people are trying to leave their bodies behind. Beloved then focuses on a woman whose face she wants because it is hers. The rest of the monologue consists of Beloved's description of her attempt to join with a woman. She wishes she could bite the iron circle from around the woman's neck and mentions the woman's sharp earrings and round basket several times. At the end of the chapter, Beloved is in the water, and neither she nor the woman has an iron circle around her neck any longer. She is swallowed by the woman and, suddenly, she is the woman. She sees herself swim away and says, "I am alone." She then describes emerging from the water and needing to find a place to be. When she opens her eyes, she sees the face she lost. She says that Seth's is the face that left her. Beloved ends her monologue by saying, "Now we can join a hot thing." Beloved's words give way to a passage of poetic prose in which the three women's voices come together and mingle, although not in a typical dialogic style. Beloved says that she and Seth lost and found one another. She tells Seth that she came back from the other side for her, that she remembers her, and that she is scared the men without skin will come back. Seth assures her that they will not. Denver warns Beloved not to love Seth too much. Beloved says she already loves Seth too much, and Denver promises to protect her. Beloved begs Seth never to leave her again and Seth complies. Beloved laments that Seth left and hurt her. Paul D., who has been sleeping in a basement of the local church, is filled with despair. He reflects on his past and notes that his two half-brothers, Paula and Paul F., are the only family he has ever known. He does not remember his mother and never saw his father. Throughout his life, whenever he met large black families living together, he loved to hear them describe to him how they were related. Paul D.'s thoughts turn to Mr. Garner, who always said that he treated his slaves as real men. In his mind, Paul D. has contrasted school teachers' emasculating and dehumanizing treatment of him and his fellow slaves with the more humane treatment of Mr. Garner. Now Paul D. begins to follow Hal in questioning whether there was any difference in the slave's condition under the two men. Paul D. partially blames his despair on his previous belief that he could build a life with Seth. He believes that he set his goals too high and has consequently suffered a great fall. Yet he locates the beginning of his downfall far in the past, in the tragic outcome of the slave's escape plan. Hal and Paula failed to appear at the appointed meeting time, and in their places stood schoolteacher, his nephews, and other white men, waiting for Paul D. and Sixo. Sixo's lover, the 30-mile woman, had escaped, and after he was captured Sixo behaved so maniacally that schoolteacher became convinced he would never again be a suitable slave. While schoolteacher tried to burn him alive, Sixo only laughed the first time Paul D. ever heard him do so. He shouted 7-0 over and over, referring to the baby the 30-mile woman escaped with inside her. Schoolteacher and the other men dragged Paul D. back home, where he encountered Seth. Despite the recent disaster, she still intended to run. That was the last time the two saw each other, and Paul D. concludes that Seth's rape and the theft of her milk must have taken place directly afterward. It was in the aftermath of the failed escape that Paul D. first learned the price he fetched, $900. The knowledge forever affected his understanding of himself. He wonders what Paul F.'s price was and what Seth's would be. He questions whether his life since his aborted escape has been worth it, whether he should have thrown himself into the fire with Sixo. Stampede visits Paul D. in the church and finds that Paul D. has been drinking his troubles away. A white man stops by to ask if the men know Judy of Plank Road. Though Stamp knows her, he feigns ignorance. The white man reprimands Paul D. for drinking on church grounds and then rides away. Stampede tells Paul D. that during the year that his young master slept with Vashti, Stamp's wife, Stampede did not touch her. When Vashti came to him one night to tell him that she had returned for good, he felt the terrible urge to break her neck. Instead, he changed his name. The conversation turns to 124, and Stampede tells Paul D. that he was present when Seth tried to kill her children. He defends Seth's actions, saying she only wanted to hurt the herder. Paul D. replies that Seth scares him but that Beloved scares him more. Stampede asks if Paul D left 124 because of Beloved, but Paul D does not answer. Although Stamp's act of renaming himself signals a kind of spiritual rebirth and reclamation, his new name also testifies to the trauma he has endured under slavery. There is an element of loss in what is otherwise a gesture of strength and self-affirmation. Indeed, in many ways the renaming might be seen as a metaphorical suicide. Stamp had initially wanted to kill one of the masters rather than surrender Vashti, but Vashti had insisted that this would lead only to Stamp's own death and begged him not to undertake the murder. Thus, although Stamp preserved himself out of respect for Vashti's wishes, he denied his natural feelings of rage and assumed a new identity free of emotional ties or bonds. Stamp estranges himself emotionally from Vashti and devotes the rest of his life to helping others pay off whatever they owed in misery. While Stamp's new identity is assuredly a positive one, it is still born at the expense of the old. Like Stampede, Paul D is estranged from himself. Since slavery, Paul D has developed emotional coping mechanisms such as the "tin heart" that discourage him from loving too passionately and require him to keep his feelings and memories locked away. The novel is full of evidence of Paul D's self-alienation. For example, on one occasion in Georgia, Paul D was unable to tell whether the screaming he heard was coming from himself or from someone else. He often questions his worth, as he does in chapter 24, and he frequently seems unsure of why he does certain things. For example, he cannot explain why he succumbs to Beloved's seductions, or why he suddenly suggests that he and Seth have a baby together.